Welcome to Reformed Thinking. You know, when we read through the Old Testament, some parts can feel, well, just chaotic, especially the period from the Judges all the way through the Kings. But what if I told you there's a single golden thread running through all of it? A single unwavering purpose that drives the entire story. And that purpose is the glory of God's great name. So let's start with how things looked right before Israel even had a king. This one verse from the book of Judges it perfectly captures the whole era. It was total anarchy. No central authority, no moral compass. The people started serving the Baals, basically the pagan gods of all the nations around them, and things just spiraled downward. In this bleak backdrop, well, it was providentially designed to show us just how deep our sin really goes. So what was the real root of all this rebellion? The prophet Jeremiah, he gives us the diagnosis. See, the problem wasn't just political chaos, it was deep spiritual treason, and he calls it a double evil. First, they forsook God, the only source of true life, the fountain of living waters. And second, they tried to create their own satisfaction by digging what he calls broken cisterns. Just picture trying to dig a well, but it's full of cracks and can't hold a single drop of water. That's the key right there. Sin is looking at the infinite, soul-satisfying value of God and saying, nah, I'll take this worthless substitute instead. Okay, so in the middle of all this mess, how does God reveal his glory? Well, let's look at one of the most famous stories from this period, Gideon's battle against the Midianites. This is an absolute masterclass in how God orchestrates events to just completely dismantle human pride. So Gideon rallies his troops, and 32,000 men show up. That's a pretty respectable army, right? But God's response is just stunning. He says, the people with you are too many. Too many for what? Too many for God to get the glory? So first thing, God tells Gideon to send home anyone who's afraid. And poof, 22,000 men leave. That brings the army down to 10,000. Okay, the odds are getting a lot worse, but God says it's still too big. The danger of human pride is still there. And then we get to the final, almost unbelievable reduction. After this simple test at the water's edge, Gideon's army is cut down to just 300 men. 300 guys against an enemy that the Bible describes as being like locusts in abundance. The situation is humanly impossible, and that is exactly the point. And right there, God tells us exactly why. He engineered this impossible victory so that Israel could never, ever claim they did it themselves. See, the very essence of sin is pride. It's about making much of ourselves. God's providence here is designed to completely silence that pride and make sure that he alone gets all the praise. All right, let's move into the next major era. The anarchy of the Judges finally ends when the people demand a king. And this leads us to this fascinating paradox. The founding of an institution that was born out of sin, but would be used for God's ultimate glory. So you've got this incredible tension, right? On the one hand, God had actually prophesied way back in Deuteronomy that Israel would one day have a king. It was part of his plan all along. But on the other hand, the people's demand for a king, right then and there, was an act of treason. They were literally trying to dethrone God himself, who was their true king. So why in the world does God grant their sinful request? This verse gives us the bedrock reason. God's commitment to his people isn't based on their goodness or their wisdom or anything in them. It's grounded in his absolute, unwavering commitment to the glory and honor of his own great name. By giving them a king, he's setting the stage to display his sovereign grace in a way no one could have ever seen coming. And that grace, well, it produced the most unexpected fruit. Out of this act of rebellion, God brought forth these incredible instruments for his own praise. He turns a sinful institution into a source of blessing that would shape worship for thousands of years. So the monarchy kicks off with Saul. He's the king the people wanted, what they thought a king should look like. But God quickly moves on to install his own choice, David, a man after his own heart. And then, of course, comes David's son, Solomon, the great builder. Let's look at how God used these flawed men for his glory. I mean, this is just a stunning irony of grace. The monarchy starts as an act of treason against God. But within a single generation, God raises up King David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. He's the one who writes so many of the Psalms and solidifies poetic praise as central to Israel's life. A kingship that began in rebellion becomes a fountain of God-exalting worship. It's incredible. Then you get to Solomon, and he builds this magnificent temple. and listen to the purpose in his dedication prayer. The temple wasn't just for Israel. It was meant to be an international beacon of God's mercy, built so that foreigners could come for the sake of your great name and find forgiveness. The goal was global, God-centered worship from the very beginning. Of course, as we know, the monarchy eventually crumbles under the weight of its own sin. But even here, in the judgment and exile, we see God's unwavering commitment to his name. You see, the fall of the kingdom is not a failure of God's plan, it's actually the next stage of it. The history here is pretty straightforward and brutal. The northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria in 722 BC. Then the southern kingdom of Judah falls to Babylon in 586 BC, and the people are dragged off into exile. From any human perspective, this is a complete and utter disaster. But what is God doing? And this is the theological climax of the whole story. When God promises to restore Israel from exile, he makes his motive crystal clear. It's not because they deserve it. It's not because they've earned it. He says, I am acting solely to vindicate the holiness of my own name, which had been profaned among the nations. Protection, judgment, and restoration. It's all driven by his zeal for his glory. All of this, the flawed judges, the treasonous kings, the glorious temple, the devastating exile, it was all setting the stage. It was creating a deep hunger and even a vocabulary for the one, true, perfect king who is still to come. Just think about it. Without the whole messy history of the earthly monarchy, titles like Son of David or King of Israel would be meaningless. They wouldn't land with any weight. The entire flawed history of these kings put in place the very categories and expectations that would one day be perfectly fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So here's the bottom line, the crucial takeaway from all this. The ultimate purpose of Israel's monarchy was always to point beyond itself. Its final design was the decisive revelation of the glory of God's grace in the person of his son, Jesus, the true king who would reign forever. And that just leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? If the entire arc of this crazy, messy, beautiful history is orchestrated for one ultimate purpose, the magnification of God's name, then it forces us to ask a question about our own lives. What is our ultimate goal? What's the golden thread that should run through everything we do?